basically what it was about. So I told Fredy, I asked him who this guy was, and he said, well, he's just an undocumented alien living in a place called Framingham, Massachusetts. I vaguely knew that was a suburb of Boston. But I told him that if it turns out that he's who you think he is, then he's going to need political asylum in the United States, and I will volunteer to do that. I do a lot of political asylum cases. So about 6 weeks later, Fredy called me up and he said, my gosh, with a DNA test we performed on this guy, determined that he is the biological son of a 70-year-old Guatemalan whose family he thought was totally wiped out. His wife and 9 children. Turns out only 8 of the children were killed, and this boy was kidnapped as a 3-year-old by a Guatemalan lieutenant. And I confirmed that I was prepared to represent the guy, and I, a few days later, drove up to Framingham, and I met Fredy and his family. Óscar, I already knew Fredy. I met Óscar, and we embarked on this effort to get him political asylum, which is still pending. We submitted the application. We had an interview on June 21, and we're waiting to hear from the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services the result. We're very optimistic and expect him to get political asylum. Meanwhile, I learned that the State Department and the Justice Department and Homeland Security are investigating cases of CEJIL, which was the unit of the Guatemalan military that was responsible for this massacre, who have gotten into the United States, some having applied for citizenship, and identifying those people. Several have been extradited to Guatemala. There's a case pending involving another ex-CEJIL who fled to Canada rather than face proceedings in the United States, which is still pending. And the Guatemalan courts have done a remarkable job of prosecuting 5 cases of CEJILs who've been convicted of involvement in this murder. I'm going to let the others tell those stories in more detail, but that's why I'm here today. I want to turn it over to, I think it would be better if we proceeded with a little, you don't want to start with the background. So let's go to Fredy and talk about the Guatemalan Forensic Anthropology Foundation and how you discovered Óscar.
Thank you, Scott. Well, in reality, the foundation becomes involved in this case only through the incredible investigation that lasted over 15 years, maybe even longer, that was carried out by a small NGO in Guatemala called FAMDEGUA, Families of the Illegally Detained and Disappeared. Aurelena Farfan, the director of the organization, has been working on this case since, she came to our office in 1995 to ask us to conduct the original exhumation. And we couldn't do it because there was only 5 of us, and we were already doing the exhumation of Cuarto Pueblo, a place where 424 victims had been killed. So we couldn't do Cuarto Pueblo and Dos Erres. So the Argentine team conducted the original exhumation in 1995. During that entire time, Aurelena continued the investigation, and at some point, some of the perpetrators of the CEJILs spoke to her and mentioned these 2 children that had been taken by some of the CEJILs heading the whole operation. Later on, with the prosecutor's office, a very brave assistant prosecutor, Sara Romero, became involved, and she took on the task of searching for these children. Eventually, in 2011, they think they found Óscar, and they contact us. They knew I was coming up to New York for the Human Rights Watch Film Festival, and they said, listen, we think we found the location of one of these children. We spoke to him. He has agreed to take a DNA test. Could you go up to Framingham, Massachusetts to take the sample? And I had no idea where that was. We had a little town outside of Boston.
You needed GPS to find Framingham.
Yeah. And we, Jessica, one of our investigators, and I drove up to Framingham and spent the morning with Oscar. I had a lot of questions. I interviewed him. Jessica took his sample through a buccal swab. And we went back to Guatemala and compared his DNA profile first to the other surviving child, now a young man who lives in Canada, to see if they were related. That was one of the theories of the investigation. And the other was to compare both of them to this 70-year-old man, Don Tranquilino, who had not been present during the massacre, and that's why he survived it, basically. He only heard that he shouldn't go back because they killed everyone, including his wife and 9 children. When we compared the profiles, we can confirm that they were definitely not related. There was no relationship between Ramiro, the other boy, and Oscar. But we did find a relationship between Don Tranquilino and Oscar. As soon as we found that out, obviously the first person I called, even before the prosecutor or anyone, was Scott, because I knew that from talking to Oscar, one of the things that worried him not only was this new revelation, he had no idea this, was his immigration status. And we knew that these findings could, well, potentially put him in danger because of all of the trials occurring in Guatemala, and also because of the people being arrested in the United States. So I called Scott. He said, of course, I meant what I said back then, and so when I called Oscar, August 7th or 8th, I told him that we confirmed that he wasn't the brother of Ramiro, that we did find his father, and that we had a lawyer for him. And that's been, what, about 10 months now, and a lot has occurred. We have also become friends along this journey. When I say we, I mean Aurelena Farfan, myself, brought Don Tranquilino to the United States on May 28th, where we were met by Scott, Oscar, and his family, and they met for the first time physically. They had only spoken through Skype in the past, and it's an incredible story, and we'll let Oscar speak of what this has meant for him in his life, and how everything is going to change, and how he's attempting to cope with it. I can begin to imagine what this means. But Dos Erres is only one of our cases. And the Dos Erres, and you heard me say that the case was originally exhumed in 1995. And you might correct me with this because I don't know the exact dates, but I think in 2009, the Inter-American Court, in one of its sentences, tells the Guatemalan, the state of Guatemala, that they should re-exhume the bodies to try to identify them, because now there was new technology that could be used to identify them. The Guatemalan government did not have the capacity to do so. The foundation, we have a specialized DNA laboratory, specialized in extracting DNA from bone. We have special software that was developed by a company called GeneCodes. Its creator and president is here, Howard Cash has joined us today. And this software was developed for the identification of the victims of the World Trade Center. And GeneCodes donated a copy to Guatemala so we can conduct these comparisons. And it's as if this software was designed for such a complex situation as Guatemala. So the Guatemalan government came to us and asked us if we could go back, re-exhume the bodies in Dos Erres, and try to identify the victims. So that's how Don Tranquilino came to us, his father, because we contacted all the surviving family members, took their reference samples, and again took samples from the skeletons and began to do comparisons using this software. So far, we have identified 4 of the 152 victims that we have. Now, those numbers will vary, but our findings are that we have at least, or a minimum number of 152 individuals. And we are comparing those to all the families, including now Oscar's sample. He also becomes a reference for the remaining his remaining 8 brothers and sisters, and his mother. They were also killed there. But once again, that is just one of the cases we're working on. Probably a little more pertinent to the discussion going on in Washington currently is that we are working in what's called a military zone in Guatemala, formerly military zone number 21, that covered the northern region of the country, north central region of the country. That military installation was set up in 1971 and operated till 2003, 2004. And it was then given over to the United Nations to serve as the training center for peacekeeping operations for all of Central America. And it's called now Creo en Paz. It's still run by the Guatemalan Army. It has always been under control of the Guatemalan Army since 1971. And what we had there was witnesses saying that in 6 different locations, it's a very big area, there was graves, these 6 different locations. 2 hours after we began, we had found already one of the graves. And up to date, we've been working there for the last 4.5 months. We have so far exhumed 307 bodies from 20 graves in the first location. We haven't found bodies in 3 other locations, but we have also found 24 graves in the 5th location with an unknown number of bodies right now. We're estimating that at least we're going to find, with the graves that we have found so far, at least 500 bodies there. And it's important to remember that this is within a military installation. The other thing that we have found that is also very pertinent to today's discussion is documents, official military documents. We've actually found 11 bundles of official documents, either partially buried or on the surface around the grave area. These documents span a time period between 1985 and 2009. They are military documents telling us of internal movements and just daily reports from different military bases, not only from the military base where they were found. And this is basically evidence that these types of documents do exist and that they are being disposed of in such a way around the grave area. And we believe that this is something important to take into account. Besides the fact that we are working in this military base, we also have identified another 25 military installations that we believe should be investigated. And we are working very closely with the Human Rights Office of the Prosecutors of the Ministerio Público. One of these exhumations will begin in August 1st, but the other 24 will probably take a couple of years to begin, yes. Besides that, we're also conducting still investigations in about 120 communities per year where massacres or individual extrajudicial executions occurred, as well as conducting massive exhumations in cemeteries in urban areas. Antigua is Quintana, and the largest one is in Guatemala City, where so far we have exhumed a total of about 18,000 bodies, out of which we're looking for about 1,000 victims. And here it's different, and that's why we have to work differently. We have the cases in the massacres where we usually know that the people up there are victims, and we usually know who they are. We have the people in the military bases where we have lots of victims, but we don't know who they are. And then we have the people disappeared in urban centers. We don't know who they are, and we don't know where their bodies are, but we believe that a lot of the bodies of the people that were victims of enforced disappearance were executed and their bodies thrown in the streets. The system picked them up, the police picked them up, takes them to the morgue, and then buries them in cemeteries as unidentified John and Jane Does. We are looking for those bodies within these 17,000 bodies in the cemetery in Guatemala. And that is probably the most difficult task, because I mean, we have to literally go through every single one of these bodies. They were placed in bone pits that are about 4 meters in diameter, and the largest one is 25 meters in depth. And we are taking DNA samples from upper teeth, as well as a small segment of the back of every left femur, extracting DNA and inserting that DNA profile in emphasis, which is the basis of our national DNA data bank. to be able to identify all of these victims, we also have a program, an outreach program that invites any family member to call a number, a 4-digit number called, it's 1598. They can call this number to get information and also to make an appointment with our investigators so they can give their DNA sample. Thank you.
Thank you, Fredy. Óscar?
Hi, everybody. Probably many of you guys haven't heard or read about my story. I'm a guy that grew up in a little town over in Guatemala called Zacapa. I've lived there for about 15 years, 18 years, and then I come to the USA. With the family that I grew up, for me was a very lovely family. They will take very good care of me, and in 2000, the year 2000, were people from the public ministry in Guatemala looking for me on that town. By that time, I was already in this country. They were looking for me. They were saying that I could be one survivor from a massacre that occurred in 1982 over in Guatemala. And they were looking for me because they believed that I had a brother, this guy Ramiro, and I could be brothers. Back at that time, I called my family over because they were already here, and they found an article on the newspaper. These people from the public ministry put on the news for Guatemala City, and they sent it to me. And when I called my family back there, they have no idea either what they were talking, what they were looking for. They didn't know why they were agreeing that stuff. So I basically didn't put too much attention as they confirmed that I was the son of the brothers. And after that year, last year, 2011, they came back to look for me. And this time they went to my, overall the investigation, they finally ended up finding my wife's parents. And they went over there and asked for me, and my wife's parents didn't give them too much information. But these people say that they were looking for me, they have something very important to discuss with me. And they left the phone numbers over there, and I don't know how fast they called me. My wife's parents called me and told me that, listen, there's people from the public ministry looking for you. I was like, why are they looking for me? I haven't got anything done over there. I don't know, but they say that there's something very important that you need to call them and that they need to talk to you. So they left the phone number there, and I called this lady, Sarah Romero, who's works for the public ministry, who's been in charge to do all this investigation. At the time that I called her, she was in the office, I guess, but I can hear that everybody when I called, they were trying to see where she was in that time because she wasn't in the office. So she wasn't there, and I left the phone number, and she called me back in like in half an hour. And she started to explain me that I maybe were aware about all this information that they had, but it was my right to know what happened, and if I will be willing to take a DNA test to confirm all the investigation that they will be getting done, but it will be impossible to confirm without me given the permission to take a DNA test. So what they were looking for is they were trying to find out if me and the other guy were brothers. And, so I told her that it was fine, that we agreed to have a DNA test, what could happen, you know, just trying to help them. And after we spoke, I told her that it was okay. And they she contacted these guys from the Fundación de Antropología, and they were coming to New York at that time, and they said that they would be coming to my home over in Framingham, in Massachusetts. And they come, they take the samples, and they told me that they will call me with the results in a couple months. So they left. When they after the 2 months, they called me in August in 2011. Fredy called me and he say that the results has been done, and I was waiting for the result to say it. And he said, we compare your samples with the results from Ramiro Romero, and he said, you guys not brothers. You guys, it's a huge possibility that you guys not even close to be family. And I was like, well, kind of what I was expecting to hear at that time. And then he said, but it's not, we compare with other people. And let me tell you that the person that you believe it wasn't your father, he wasn't your father. He just adopted you. You have another father, your biological father, called Tranquilino Castañeda. And after that point, I was like, I didn't know what to say. I was like completely blank. And after a while, like being taken, reading about what happened, reading about the guy who adopted me, were in the army in that group. So I was like accepting that I probably could have another family. And then we spoke with my father Tranquilino over by the computer. And after that, we called almost every day each other. And on May of this year, he finally come over and we get to meet personally. And he's living with me right now. And that's about what I can say. Probably hear more about these guys to know much better about the case. That's very much what happened and what's happening right now. And it's a lot of cousins, sons from my aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters from my biological mother around the USA that they can't wait anymore for us to meet. After they know about it, they always hear about what happened to her, his cousins and her aunt, and now they couldn't believe that they have another cousin that come from there. So it was happy ending at the end. Very good.
Thank you, Óscar. Talk about the details of
every living person in the settlement of Dos Erres butchered, but their bodies were hidden in a deep, covered well, a well that would not be uncovered for another, I think, 13 years, were scattered in fields, hidden from sight. Their animals were killed, their furniture and their possessions were taken by a nearby military base, by the commander of that base, taken, put into trucks and loaded out for use by the military. And their houses were burned to the ground. So after the massacre, there was literally nothing left except kind of the charred remains of this community and the years that it had lived there. And the soldiers that carried out the massacre made sure to convey the message clearly that anyone inquiring about it or trying to get to the bottom of it would die. It was that simple. And that helps explain in some ways something that's hard from a distance to understand, how people who could have known in some ways about the massacre because they were related to someone inside the village but weren't there that day could have been quiet for so long because the fear was that powerful and that intense. And of course the Rios Montt regime and successive governments always denied that that massacre had ever taken place at the hand at the hands of their own soldiers. So given that context and that history, Óscar's case in many ways seems like a miracle. That he was ever found, that he was ever put together again decades later with his biological father. But of course it was not a miracle. It was the result of years and years of dedicated work by a group of activists and investigators, and one dogged prosecutor who was operating under the radar quietly, looking into this, pulling on that thread for 15 years. And it was a very hard mystery to unravel. As I said, it took years before the lid was lifted off that well, so we never even saw the exhumed bodies of the victims of this massacre until 1995. And when we did, that was through an exhumation not by the government, but by an Argentine non-governmental organization, forensic anthropologists. The testimony that was finally collected of two soldiers who, out of some mixture of remorse or fear, finally came forward and told what they had done, was gathered by a human rights activist, Aura Elena Farfan, not by, again, the government, until the prosecutor, Sara Romero, got involved. The only official documents that were ever found about Dos Erres, the only government documents, were US documents. They were US declassified cables from the US Embassy in Guatemala City, which days after the massacre, because of information from a reliable source, sent a team of investigators from the embassy in a helicopter to fly over the site and then to interrogate or interview people at the Las Cruces military base nearby. And on the basis of the information they were able to gather, again, days after the massacre, they concluded that the army was likely responsible for the killing of those citizens. A couple of weeks, by the way, after sending that cable to Washington, the Reagan administration went ahead with a long-planned offer of helicopters and spare parts to the Guatemalan army, despite the information that was reflected about the army's role in that massacre. The DNA evidence that helped produce some of the most important revelations about the massacre, again, was created, obtained, and processed by a non-governmental organization, the Forensic Anthropologists Foundation of Guatemala. And the very first sentence against a perpetrator of that massacre did not take place in Guatemala. It took place in the United States, in a federal courtroom in Florida, thanks to the efforts of a unit inside the US Justice Department with the help of ICE to identify perpetrators of the Dos Erres massacre living in this country. So Dos Erres is an extraordinary case, it is an important case, and it is an amazing achievement for human rights and justice in Guatemala, but it is an outlier. There are very, very few cases like this because of the work that goes into this on the part, essentially, of civil society to make this possible. And for that reason, and for all of the other thousands of cases of the hundreds of massacres that have not been prosecuted or even investigated, of the extrajudicial killings, of the thousands of forced disappearances, of the rapes, of the cases of systemic torture. Because of all of those cases that continue to be pending, if you will, in Guatemala, it is absolutely vital that we continue to press the Guatemalan government to step up to its role in assisting in the investigation, clarification, and possible prosecution of these cases. What has the government done to date? I mean, successive governments in Guatemala have not been completely silent or sitting with their arms crossed. The government signed the peace accords. The government joined in a truth commission and agreed to permit that commission to operate. The government set up a series of post-conflict institutions to address issues like reparations and human rights. In fact, the last government before this current one, President Colom's administration created something called the Archives of Peace, which was an institution, not so much an archive, that's really a misnomer, because the Archives of Peace was an organization operating under the Secretary of Peace and under the presidency that gathered and served as a repository for digital copies, so not original copies, of government records that were important for understanding what had happened in the conflict. So there were some military records available through the Archives of Peace, again, digital copies of them. There were records about adoptions that took place during the conflict that helped people unravel some of the few kind of abducted or stolen children cases in Guatemala and others. The Archives of Peace also served a kind of social function. It organized conferences about the conflict. It put out reports that helped explain what had happened and explored the significance of the records they held. And it worked closely with and through a signed agreement with the public ministry to prepare expert testimony or analysis for cases that were going forward inside the justice system. So the Archives of Peace was a very important, I think, advance on the part of the government in support of post-conflict reparations and clarification. And then most recently, the Colom administration tried to establish what it called a military archive, some kind of collection of records from the Guatemalan army that would presumably serve to the understanding, again, of what happened during the conflict and what the Army's role has been. That said, that sort of panorama of modest, I would say, modest achievements on the part of the Guatemalan government in general and across the decades since the conflict, during it, after the peace accords, the Guatemalan government has generally really failed to support a robust clarification and justice process inside Guatemala. It has denied its role, the Army's role in the massacres. It has not ever offered members of the armed forces or the intelligence services or the police forward to give testimony in these cases. It has never provided key documents or records from inside its own archives in support of these cases. Any of the documents that you might have heard, those of you who know something about Guatemala, that you might have heard about, documents like the famous military logbook that chronicles the disappearance of hundreds of Guatemalan citizens, or the Operación Sofía, which is a set of planning documents and reports from the field on a series of scorched earth or counterinsurgency sweeps in the CEJIL. These documents were leaked secretly by someone or by people within Guatemala to outsiders, to foreigners, who then, it was the National Security Archive that received them and took them out of the country. So although they are critical for helping explain the role of government forces in the conflict and specifically in perpetrating human rights violations, these were not documents voluntarily provided by the government itself. And most recently, since the election of President Pérez Molina, although his government has, in a very welcome gesture, supported the continuance of the international investigating body, the CEJIL, that is looking into organized crime in Guatemala, that's been in place since 2007. And although President Pérez Molina has offered, again, welcome support to the crusading Attorney General Claudia Paz y Paz, who has been spearheading many of the most important human rights cases and many other criminal cases inside Guatemala since her appointment in 2010. The Pérez Molina administration has also made the decision to dismantle the Peace Archive a mere 2 or 3 years after its creation, to fire its analysts and its director, to disperse its digital collections in other institutions. The Pérez Molina government has aggressively opposed the charge of genocide, and has done so at a time when a former president of Guatemala, or chief of state of Guatemala, Efraín Ríos Montt, is under house arrest and under indictment precisely on the charge of genocide. So very problematically, the government's officials are sending the message that they are determined to overcome this smear, as they see it, calling what happened in Guatemala genocide. The government has continually floated the possibility of some kind of new or reconfigured amnesty or pardon. And very recently, and this is what Francisco will talk about and will help me sort of segue into his presentation, the government has taken an extremely hostile and I would say surprising stance in opposition to the rulings of the Inter-American Court. So we're in a precarious moment, I think, in terms of the search for accountability and justice in Guatemala. There are some extraordinary achievements, both behind the country and I think ahead, as cases that are in the pipeline and again are the results of decades of work on the part of really extraordinary and determined activists and civil society groups. But at the same time, this takes place within this context of an administration, a new administration that has many years to come in office, that has been very outspoken in its opposition to a number of the kind of key precepts of the human rights catastrophe that took place in Guatemala and how society is trying to address it currently. Thanks very much, and I'll pass the word to Francisco.
Okay, thank you very much. Hey, well, I would like to thank WOLA for this opportunity to talk about the impact of the recent actions of the Guatemalan government before the Inter-American system of human rights. In order to understand this reaction, we have to remember that Guatemala is the second state with more judgments before the Inter-American Court, along with Peru. With the exception of 2 cases, the other 12 deal with the violations of human rights during the armed conflict. There are many facts, names, and truths in those judgments that are very uncomfortable for many people still around in positions of power. The litigation of paradigmatic cases at the international level reflects, among other things, the incapacity of the state to bring adequate answers to human rights violations in its own jurisdiction. And this is particularly true not only in Guatemala, but in many countries with respect to justice. Governments are not complying with the judgments, and therefore we are not seeing justice. Victims, NGOs, human rights defenders, the only alternative that have left is to go to the international level. As Fredy mentioned, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has ordered many reparations that if the Guatemalan government had complied with, we wouldn't be talking today about, we wouldn't be having this discussion today, because many of those reparations were specifically addressed to fight impunity. For example, in the year 2003, in the Mirnamak case, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights specifically ordered the Guatemalan government to give access to documents that the state had, including military documents. In the year 2004, with the Molina Thyssen case, the Guatemalan government was ordered to create a DNA database, which the government didn't do, and that's why some civil society NGOs had to create these databases. There is no progress in the compliance of these most significant reparations, and at the Inter-American level, we are trying to request some action from the Inter-American Court. Normally, we will do the compliance of these judgments individually, but since we have identified a common tendency of the Guatemalan government not to comply with the reparations that will address impunity, or will address the fight to impunity, we are asking the Inter-American Court of Human Rights to do a joint compliance on all these cases. We had a similar experience with Colombia that we hope that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights will accept in the Guatemalan cases. In Colombia, we dealt with issues of health, but in Guatemala, we are specifically requesting the court to look at the compliance of 11 cases dealing with reparations that have to do with the investigations of all of them. But today, as Kate already mentioned, we are facing with a strong rejection from the Guatemalan authorities towards the authority of the Inter-American Court to deal with cases that address forced disappearances, torture, and, as it was already mentioned, genocide. Behind all this is the continuation of the political war that started after the peace agreement of 1996, a war against impunity and the search for effective sanctions on the most grave violations of human rights that cannot be covered by any amnesty laws. Last month, during the hearing of the massacre of Rio Negro before the Inter-American Court, the Guatemalan government argued that the Inter-American Court was not competent to address claims of genocide or forced disappearance since it was not an international criminal court. But this is exactly what the Inter-American Court has done in the last 20 years, adjudicate and denounce the most outrageous violations not only in Guatemala, but in Colombia and Peru, among other states. But let me clarify something. The Inter-American Court cannot declare a violation on the Genocide Convention or in a convention that addresses crimes against humanity. But the Inter-American Court, when studying forced disappearances, torture, or systematic executions in some cases, has identified these actions as grave violations of human rights, crimes against humanity, and in some cases genocide. It's not that the court is declaring the violation, but on those grounds, but the court can identify that the patterns and the systematic way in which these actions were carried out would classify as those international crimes. This has been really useful for human rights defenders in order to present these arguments before national tribunals, national authorities, in order to activate the investigation of these crimes. In the case of Guatemala, not only the agents of the state before the Inter-American Court made these pronouncements, but as Kate already mentioned, the president himself used these arguments, which is really alarming. There is a tendency in the countries that appear before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights to try to nullify the effects of the pronouncements of the Inter-American Court. Just to give an example, last Friday, the Supreme Court of Peru ruled against the perpetrators of massacres, systematic executions in Peru committed by the Grupo Colina, the paramilitary or the group in charge of executions during the Fujimori regime. So this is similar to what we are seeing in Guatemala. There is a tendency from local authorities to go against the decisions of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. In the Guatemalan case, this kind of speech has a political objective at the national level and is to overcome the amnesty laws that are being applied within the country. In the Erres case, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights specifically mentioned that the amnesty law, the Guatemalan amnesty law, cannot cover forced disappearances, tortures, and genocide. And that's why we are seeing all this speech from the Guatemalan authorities before the court, and also from the Guatemalan president. But the Guatemalan president went even further. He mentioned that in order to make the court correct its activities, he was going to talk to the Secretary General of the OAS, Mr. Jose Miguel Insulza. So this is really worrisome because there is a direct attack on the autonomy and independence of the court. The Secretary General of the OAS cannot tell the Inter-American Court of Human Rights what to do or what not to do. And this is a tendency that we are also seeing in the last year from many governments that belong to the OAS system. And we have to remember what happened in the last General Assembly in Cochabamba, just also last June, where many of the states are claiming for reforms to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, directly attacking the autonomy and independence of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. I just wanted to mention this because the next General Assembly is going to be held in Guatemala next year. So the messages that we are listening now from the President of Guatemala and from other governments against the autonomy and independence of the Inter-American Commission and Court of Human Rights will be a part of the debate in the next General Assembly. So this is something that we have to look carefully, so that the Inter-American system, that is the only option left for victims that cannot find justice in their countries, this is the only option that they have left to bring their cases. And with that, I will conclude.
Thank you, Francisco. Thanks to all of our speakers for a very comprehensive and also very personal overview of the situation or a lot of the challenges facing Guatemala looking at these cases of justice. We have about 25 minutes for questions. I'm going to open it up to any questions or comments.
The amnesty rhetoric that's coming from the executive branch, how real of a threat is that to these future human rights cases? How viable is it?
How viable? You know, one way in which the government obstructs or stonewalls on cases, human rights cases, it's a time-tested formula that in fact has been so notable that the Inter-American Court has ruled against it many, many times, is the use of appeals and other delaying tactics to just slow cases down to molasses level. So they might enter the system in the year 2000 and you might see no movement whatsoever until the year 2015. And I have a feeling that this kind of balloon of a new amnesty it may be more about finding strategies to introduce possible bills or find formulas in which a kind of pardon could be proposed that ultimately I have a hard time believing would fly ultimately, but I think it could really slow down the process. I say ultimately I have a hard time believing it would fly because amnesty in general is such a discredited form of addressing, I mean blanket amnesty in general is such a discredited form now of addressing human rights violation and state conflict that I think there'd be an uproar both at the national level and certainly in the Inter-American system. So I'm not sure that it's viable as an actual legal tool down the road. I think it's viable as a profound delaying tactic, and that's what worries me. If they're ready to sort of embark on that effort, it could be a real discouragement for some of these cases.
I think a good example of what Kate is saying is that maybe I think it was February or March, the bill was almost passed. It lost in Congress by a few votes. Nobody really found out about it after it passed, but the bill was to put an age limit on these types of prosecutions, and the age limit was, I think, 80 years old.
You come back.
Yeah.
Statute of limitations or age limit on the individual?
Age limit on the individual.
Once you're past 80 years old.
Or 75.
Free ride. 75.
75.
All the
Then
Nazis would.
you couldn't be tried, and you know we have two former presidents under house arrest right now who are both over that age limit. So it was an attempt, a real attempt that failed, but nonetheless, that's the type of thing that can happen.
In other parts of the world, kind of the way a lot of these things are addressed is with some established third-party court like The Hague. As far as I know, President Fujimori was the first head of state ever to be extradited back to the country he had led to be tried. Now, I'm not sure what the pros and cons are of having I like your opinion on the pros and cons of having things tried in the country where they took place. We might have the interference of the local government, but you're close to the site of the event, or having things handled in a third-party country in somewhere in Latin America.
I'd like to say something about that, and it, based on my experience, I spent 10 years as a prosecutor, and in my human rights work, I've investigated homicides, the El Salvador cases, homicide, the La Quillia Moffat case in Chile, homicides in Mexico and how they're prosecuted. And I see real opportunities here for two countries that have big policy interests. One is Guatemala. Guatemala has to reestablish its legitimacy in the world community, and that's a big, big challenge for President Perez Molina, and I think he understands that and he wants to do it. And he's speaking sort of with two voices. He's got to address the world community. He has caused the country to sign the Treaty of Rome and take part in the International Criminal Court, which is a huge and more than symbolic step forward. At the same time, there's all this rhetoric in the country about, you know, what they're not going to do and what they dispute in terms of how these cases should be handled. The United States government has an even bigger challenge and policy interest. As we discovered in El Salvador in 1981, when we learned that 4 American citizens were murdered by the Salvadoran National Guard, we have a big national interest. We're living in a hemisphere with a lot of other countries, and our justice systems and their quality are very important to us. In 1981, when we got involved in the Churchwoman's case, El Salvador did not have any capacity to investigate or prosecute a case like that. They had never done ballistics tests. They had never done fingerprint tests. They had a judiciary and a Fiscalia, a prosecutor's office, that had never tried a case like this. And it took enormous resources from the United States government, FBI agents, teams that went down there to teach Salvadoran investigators how to do all of these things, a Justice Department prosecutor who was sent down to train the Fiscalia how to prosecute a murder case, and they were successful in convicting 5 National Guardsmen, which was key to allowing the United States to maintain the congressional support it wanted to continue giving assistance to El Salvador. What has happened in Guatemala, in at least the Dos Erres case, is a remarkable collaboration of Guatemalan civil society and the public ministry in investigating in a very sophisticated way a very difficult case and achieving a remarkable record of successful prosecutions of Caibiles responsible for the Dos Erres massacre. And it was primarily the result of, you know, remarkable efforts by 3 women who've already been mentioned, Elena Farfan of Damdegua, who found the 2 Caibiles who were willing to talk, Sarah Romero, who became a young auxiliary fiscal in 1996 and was handed this dog of a case when the government decided it had to investigate it, and for the next 15 or 20 years spent, you know, incredible efforts to identify the 2 boys who were kidnapped, and Claudio Pasipas, who led the effort to ultimately begin these prosecutions. I have here the expediente of the most recent prosecution of a Caibile, Pedro Pimentel Rios, who was convicted in March and sentenced to over 6,000 years for his involvement in the Dos Erres case. And it's a remarkable construction of a prosecution with 2 witnesses who were willing to testify, whose testimony, 2 Caibiles, Ibanez and Pinzon, whose testimony in elaborate detail identified everybody who was there and what everybody did and what happened during those 3 days of terror. But that was testimony that had to be corroborated. And I having talked to Aura Elena Farfan and knowing something about what Sarah Romero did, these 2 individuals, one a lawyer and one a non-lawyer, realized that this testimony to be credible to a judge, to courts, had to be corroborated. And they knew that the additional testimony of the 2 cooperating Caibiles, the 2 boys, a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, had been kidnapped. If they could find those 2 boys, it would corroborate the testimony, and they succeeded in doing that. One of the boys, Ramiro Osario Cristales, was 5. he's an eyewitness to what happened there because he can remember some of it. The other, Óscar Ramírez, the fact of his kidnapping and the physical evidence that supports that he was the boy who was kidnapped is also physical evidence corroborating the testimony of these two cooperating CEJILes. This is a remarkable case, and Guatemala should be holding it up as an example of what they can do and what their government, what the Perez Molina government is doing to reestablish Guatemala's legitimacy in the world community, and having created on their own, without all the efforts that the FBI and the Justice Department put into places like El Salvador and Peru to create justice systems, they did it on their own. And I'm hoping that the government recognizes the importance of efforts like this and uses them to its advantage. It's also hugely important to the United States government because we have a big narcotics trafficking problem in this region, and we need functioning justice systems in Central America to deal with it. And Guatemala has the opportunity to become the model for all of that. And big benefits flow from that, both for Guatemala and the United States. And I hope these two governments and all the governments in the region recognize and take advantage of the opportunity right now to build on these successes.
Can I, before you answer, just try to address another aspect of your question, which is, you know, what Scott says is exactly right. Obviously, the strengthening of the national justice system is kind of, you know, objective number one for any country and for any international player hoping to reinforce the possibility of justice around the world. That said, the international system and various international versions of international courts or judicial regimes play a tremendously important role in pushing those national systems. And I think there's an interplay there. I mean, what you're tapping into with your question is something that is a very lively and robust debate within the international community. Precisely what are the role of these international tribunals or an international criminal court? And I don't think anyone who is in support of those, a role for those international tribunals, I don't think anyone believes that they should displace or replace the process inside a country. But when you have countries like Guatemala or El Salvador, in which the justice system has been dysfunctional for a long time, or corrupt for a long time, or undermined in some way for a long time, and perhaps is like struggling to get back to being a functioning, properly functioning justice system, those international institutions and judicial entities can play a really important role in pushing and prodding the local or national justice system to take steps.
Again, there's a good example of that with the CJA case taken to the Spanish courts and presented as international or universal jurisdiction on the genocide case in Guatemala, which served and was used and is still being used by the Guatemalan public ministry to set up its genocide case within the country, where some of the same experts were used, some of the same investigations were used. So it's also part of what's pushing the system, like Kate says, both the inter-American court cases and also, in this case, the case, the genocide case in Spain.
One is for Francisco and one for Dr. Peccerelli. For CEJIL, as an international NGO that litigates before inter-American system, how do you see now the role of inter-American court in countries like Guatemala? You know, after all these rulings, what is really going on with the judicial system? All these rulings are really, you know, pushing the justice, or what's going on, and how do you see like their role for next years? And for Dr. Peccerelli, just some comments. I would like to know how is the relation between your foundation and the General Attorney or Public Ministry?
Well, the role of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in cases, in paradigmatic cases, is, well, at least for us, really useful, because at some, once you have the decision, you can still use the Inter-American Court in order to continue the dialogue, or in some cases start the dialogue with the states. There is, after the decision, there is the procedure of compliance where you can present information to the court, but most importantly, you can have hearings on the specific cases where the court will be like a mediator, and these hearings are really recent, and they have been really useful. For example, if there was a really terrible example in Guatemala where the file was lost. So it was because the file was at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights that we could get copies back and present them to the prosecutors. So there is an example of how important the role of the Inter-American Court would be. Or for example, there are some cases where the prosecutors are not willing to start a specific line of investigation, and through the mechanism of the court, we can use the court as I mentioned, as a mediator in order to start the dialogue with the authorities and continue those lines of investigations. With the cases that we have already worked with, there has many standards have been created in the Guatemalan cases or in other cases that can be used at the local level. But I think that there are more possibilities to create more standards, and as Fredy mentioned, use the Inter-American Court as a tool in order to move procedures at the local level. And in some cases it has been really effective. Unfortunately, as in Guatemala, it's not the case. But this example that I just gave of a file that was lost is also another good example of the interaction between local investigations and the international court.
As far as our relationship with the Attorney General's Office and Ministerio Público, we have a functioning written agreement where the Foundation provides forensic assistance at no cost to the prosecutor's office on all of the conflict cases. If it's a conflict case, the Foundation does it and does not request any payment for the work. We receive funding from USAID, the government of the Netherlands, Sweden to do so, and also from State Department. But the agreement also goes on to talk about current cases. And in the current cases, we have attempted to bill the cost, and unfortunately, it never happened. Now this is because in Guatemala, 5 years ago, there was a creation of the National Institute of Forensic Sciences. It's been around for 5 years now, and what it did is it took the 3 different semi-functioning forensic systems that operated, one within the police, one within the Justice Department, and one within the prosecutor's office, and united them into one institute. During the 5 years, although we participated in its creation, we have attempted to work with the National Institute of Forensic Sciences, and its director has refused completely. I mean, she has even gone as far as prohibiting her analyst of speaking to our analysts. And this is even though that the Foundation has an ISO accredited laboratory, the only one in Guatemala, and I believe the only one in the region that's outside of the state. There was a new person elected to the INASIF, and we have already met with this person, and we are probably going to be drawing up agreements. The idea here is to strengthen the forensic system for the prosecutors, for the Attorney General's office, whereby any bone-related case, whether it be conflict or non-conflict, would be given to the bone experts, which is the Foundation, and any current cases will be handled by the National Institute. The idea is to provide experts and to provide scientific results to the justice system. Who does it doesn't really matter. I mean, not to us as much, but and one of the things that we're going to be doing and we're asked to do is to strengthen the technical capacity of the National Forensic Science Institute. And one of the things they asked for was for us to take them along the route of accreditation, ISO accreditation, which is, what Howard can tell you, it's not fun and it's not easy, but we believe that Guatemala, well, we've shown that Guatemala can do it, and now we believe that the Guatemalan state can do it. We also work with RENAP, which is the office that does birth certificates and death certificates, because there is also a problem in issuing death certificates, so now we're working with them very closely. We also work with the National Commission for Adoptions, and we have an agreement with them where we also do a DNA analysis on the children that are going to be given up for adoptions. We used to work, and we probably will try to work again with the National Reparations Program. It's not as simple as it sounds, but the idea is to incorporate one individual from the foundation in each one of its 15 field offices so they can take DNA samples from all the people coming in for reparations. And we also work with the Guatemalan Human Rights Ombudsman's office as well. So our strongest relationship, however, is and has been prior to Claudia Paz y Paz, although we support her greatly, but as a matter of fact, the prior Attorney General was the one that signed this agreement with us, and we have been working since the creation of the foundation was in 1997, and even before that, but since 1997 on to today, we've been working closely, very closely with the prosecutor's office. We cannot conduct any investigations unless they are criminal investigations authorized by the prosecutor's office.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Yeah, I'm Maureen Morales with the Congressional Research Service. The current government has extended, or said it will extend CICIG, and they kept Claudia Paz y Paz in office. But how are they, how is the government staff working with them? The problem with CICIG they've encountered is that they have people who create obstacles, and they try to get rid of them. But so how, is the government cooperating with them? I mean, underneath, on top, there's this, acceptance of them, but are they making their work more difficult? Are they enabling it? How well is the government actually working with CICIG and with allowing Claudia Paz y Paz to do her work?
Boy, I can't answer on the CICIG question because I don't work with CICIG at all, but maybe there's someone in the room who knows more about that. I mean, I think that the Ministerio Público and Claudia Paz y Paz's institution has functioned freely and absolutely fine under this administration and previously. I think the only thing that I can specifically point to, which I think was a disappointment, let's say, for the investigations inside the public ministry on human rights cases specifically, was with the dismantling of this Archives of Peace, the government simply unilaterally dissolved a formal agreement or convenio that had been signed between the public ministry and the Archives of Peace to provide the kind of analysis that the public ministry always needs in the investigation and assembling or construction of these human rights cases. And that from one day to the next simply took away a really important instrument for the public ministry, which has very few investigative capacities. Let's be honest about that. They rely heavily on other institutions and individuals to do a lot of the basic investigative work that in other countries might be done by their own staff. So that's the only kind of specific instance that I can think of, but there may be somebody else.
From what I've seen, also tangentially, is that there is very close operational relationship within CICIG, the prosecutor's office, and the Minister of the Interior, which is the police. They work very closely on a lot of these cases, and at the operational level, there seems to be very little opposition. There might be some things happening politically, but again, geared more towards central government and specific parts of central government, not necessarily directed at current investigations, but more directed at conflict investigations.
I know there's a few more questions. I think we're going to close up the public panel. If people have other things, we're certainly free to approach our panelists, and thank you all for coming, particularly our speakers for sharing their information, their experiences. Also, there are some materials out on the table looking at both documents that we produce with other organizations here on concerns about the ban on U.S. military assistance, as well as, I think, the piece on ProPublica, which had worked on finding Óscar. It's a very great read, so it's out there, copies of it, looking more at the details of Óscar's case. If you have the chance to listen to This American Life, there's also a specific program called What Happened at Dos Erres that's also still available online. So thank you for
Granito.
Oh, and do you have a?
You know, Granito, because the documentary film Granito about Guatemala and the search for human rights and justice in Guatemala has been featured on POV, which is the public CBS's the public television's documentary program. Public Broadcasting System's documentary program. Because it was featured this summer on POV, POV is hosting the film and streaming it live for free for 4 months. I think there's a couple of months left. So anyone can see Granito for at least a couple more months free on POV's website. And if you haven't seen it, please go do. It will help give you so much more information about some of the work underway.
One interesting fact about Granito is that outtakes from it were used during the indictment trial proceeding of General Rios Montt in January. Specifically an interview conducted by its director, Pamela Yates, so it's an important film.
It has a remarkable interview that Pamela Yates did in 1983 or so, 1982, where as the acting president, Rios Montt makes certain admissions that as a lawyer who's been involved in some of these cases trying to establish command responsibility, pretty much closes the door on that question. It's a remarkable interview that during that era, no other commanding officer would have made in any other part of Central America, and it's a huge piece of important evidence in that case against Rios Montt.
It also details a lot of the work that was done in the Spanish courts, and in that case, so it'll be interesting for many reasons.
Check it out.
Yeah.
Thank you.